The Craft Legacy is written and directed by Zoe Liston-Jones and stars Kaylee Spaney and Michelle Monaghan and David Duchovny, and is the sequel slash, well, requel as they call it, because it's basically a fucking remake and a sequel to the original film from 1996, so that was called The Craft. And in this film, it deals with same basic story where a girl moves into town and she ends up moving to a relative and that she's staying with. In this case, it's going to be the stepdad this time who is that she's staying with instead of the other film where it was her dad. The first movie dealt with her staying at her dad's house, staying with her and her dad at this house after her mother died. So they swapped the parents in this case with the characters. And she ends up, much like the first movie, end up falling in with a group of girls that want to use her as the fourth member of their coven because they're witches. And to pretty much to learn their powers, or to go amok and use their powers and all that. Now, before I get into the movie, here's a little backstory. I actually enjoyed the first Craft movie. I actually thought that growing up with it came out around a time when we were pretty much full of witch movies that were pretty big. You know, movies like Hocus Pocus and Practical Magic and things like that. And The Craft was one of those movies that really defined what you consider a 90s movie, with the grunge kind of look, the music, the style, and, you know, just the overall, like, fun vibe of, and the charm of it with the girls, like, using their powers, like, in different ways to pretty much, to do it to define their personalities, but also use it and actually use it for a good cause, and then also have their own doubts, have their own guilt on things that happen throughout the story. And what worked about that movie was its own charm with the girls' chemistry, and you felt like a lot of the more of what happened with the girls, with how they dealt with like their personal lives and stuff, what they went through, and why they used their powers. And and of course there was always one of them that stood out in that one that felt like, you know, they wanted more than what the other one wanted and stuff, and use it for a more harmful use. And so this one, never in my mind would I ever think they would do a fucking sequel years later where you had pretty much them continuing after the events of the first film, because I always thought with the first movie that they always kept it just, you know, ended as it was. And there was actually talk for a while that they actually wanted to do a reboot of the series, but a lot of fans were outraged about hearing that because, you know, the idea of them doing a whole reboot and a full-on remake of The Craft always seemed pretty pointless. Not only for me personally, felt like it wouldn't even really stood its time nowadays, because I always felt like The Craft was more good for that era, so to speak. Kind of like movies how they did with the remake of Point Break. It's like certain movies, they're good for their time in a time capsule. Like, because Point Break, if you remember that one, it was all, you know, it was about surfing and stuff, and, you know, when the remake came out, it felt really out of place. And so with this one, my expectations were low, and this is also a film that, believe it or not, I think was meant to go to theaters, but because of the pandemic we've been going through, they ended up having to push it off and go into streaming. And so I got a chance to finally watch it, and I can honestly say, and this is also produced by Blumhouse, and knowing that they have been on a shitty fucking track record within the last few years alone, the last movies I've seen, fucking Black Christmas and Fantasy Island, there's a lot of shit that just all comes into play with this movie that I have the same complaints about like those two movies. Especially, this is on there with almost up there with Black Christmas on being that fucking bad. I was not a fan of this movie. This movie not only was really so fucking boring, but it felt to me like they did nothing with it. And it was also pissed me off in points to like that really felt generic and so uninteresting to the point that I really felt like I was watching the same movie as I did Black Christmas, and I can only say there's only things I like marginally better in this one than I do with Black Christmas, but that's not saying much. So to get my pros out of the way, I will say the main girl, Kaylee Spaney, I thought she was actually pretty good, and she actually really, I think, carries this movie the best as what she can deal with in this movie, because she's the only one out of the actual characters that actually you empathize with and you get where she's going, because she's dealing with a past with about her mother and stuff, and it ends up, you know, you follow through with her and want her to pretty much get through everything, and the way the movie plays it out. Now there could have been a lot better script how they really put more effort with telling the story with her, but as her character, you know, you feel for I felt for her, you know, and she was the only one I felt like really, you know, on a you felt on a very empathetic level, so to speak. So she was good, and I also enjoyed Michelle Monaghan's performance. I thought she was really good as her mother, and you know she brings what she can to the role. I mean, given what she's little to do with. But other than that, that's really all the pros I can fucking say. Because the rest of the cast, this is where I get to my cons. They were so awful in this. I couldn't believe like what I was watching. The other girls in the film, they come across as less, you know, I mean, they're your typical kind of, you know, girls that are into the typical teenage life and all that. And I understand that's, you know, meant to what the movie's going for, because it's probably going for a more different demographic, so to speak. Because I know the first one was more dealing with, like, you know, like teenagers and all that but it still felt like I could still watch that film and not really really matter like that it's actually, you know, girls in the movie and stuff. You know, I still enjoyed the girls in the other films because, for one, the other characters in the film I actually got into their personalities, and these not only were the actresses not good and they felt like they were so annoying at times, like fucking nails on a chalkboard, but also there was nothing to the other girls. Like, they all felt like they were just glued to the main girl with really no backstory, no development, nothing that really stands out apart from any of them. Like, they all just have, like, they're so one-dimensional, and really they're just cardboard cutouts. Like, there's nothing that really defines the rest of the characters. And because in the other film, I know I'm comparing this a lot, but the other film, you at least felt what they were going through. Like, you had Nancy dealing with her, you know, piece of shit dad in the first movie, and you had or stepdad in the first movie, and then you had Bonnie going through like the burns on herself and all that, and then you had I forgot her name. What was her name in the first one? I'm trying to remember now. But the other girl what she went through as well, like being tormented by a bully and stuff. You felt for the characters in the first one, and they had a purpose of why they used their powers. Here, I couldn't identify with any of these. You couldn't tell me which one was which, because a lot of them I almost thought I get their names mixed up half the time. And not just that, but even when they do all this stuff with the powers, this whole plot just rehashes all this stuff from the first film, beat for beat. Like, to the point where the main girl even goes through some of the same fears that Sarah did in the first film, where she's afraid of snakes. And it's like, you're not even fucking trying here. You're doing literally the same shit. And does it come into play to the rest of the story? Not really, because the rest of the story, it deals with them just using their powers like the first movie, and they reuse lines from the first one that almost feels like they just use it just for remake's sake. Like, I'm really wondering, was this intended to be a remake instead of a sequel? Because other than this minor part that I'll get to later that they bring up as a sequel part, this movie really could have just been a shot-for-shot remake, and they could have called it just The Craft. But no, they call it The Craft Legacy because it's technically a sequel, so they end up using the same levitating, light as a feather vibe from the first one. They do the whole stuff where they can called We're the Weirdos line and all that, and they also have scenes where they're using their powers, where they're doing somewhat of witchcraft, but most of the time when I'm watching this movie, I feel like I'm watching a fucking X-Men spin-off, because that's how the tone of the film really feels off when compared to the first movie. Because in this one, they're doing shit where they're using telekinesis powers and using their minds and stuff, and actually being able to like freeze time and shit. I'm like, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think fucking witchcraft does that shit. And so, yeah, this movie doesn't have the same type of tone or even remotely like vibe as far as what you're watching as far as a craft film for me. It felt more like a unaired continued reboot of the Craft series, the Charm series that came out. And even when I watched that show when I was younger, I actually even got into that show, and that show was more fucking compelling and had even more effects than this piece of shit did. Because I'm gonna tell you, that's the other thing too. The effects they use in this are not only fucking terrible with their CGI, but the last battle that they go into, which I'll explain later, it is not only just looks so cheap like a fucking Lifetime movie, but it seems like, you know, it was almost like they were on like a Microsoft PowerPoint computer or used After Effects on their computer and made the CGI look like that. That's how fucking horrible it looked. But to get more into the story, though, besides just rehashing all the stuff from the first movie, it even becomes just a point where I just felt really bored. The pacing was really bad with all the uninteresting stuff where they, you know, they're just using their powers, and they're not even really using it for much to really, like, go anywhere with it, because most of the other big problem I had with the film, and I'm not going to bring this up only because the movie does, and I'm not really a political guy or anything, but this pretty much does what they call the woke agenda, where there's a character in the film that is a bully that picks on the main girl at the beginning of the film, and this guy ends up becoming pretty much like a slave to her after she casts a spell on him. Now, in the first film, if you remember, there was a plot point that dealt with Sarah being pretty much, you know, trying to get smitten by Skeet Ulrich's character in the first one, and that worked, I think, a lot better for me because, for one, it seemed like there was still something about it to where she was still having it to where there was actually a payoff to it. And if you remember the first one, there actually was legitimate reason of, like, what happened to that character in the rest of the movie. And in this one, and then plus that character in the first one at least felt like, you know, yeah, he can be a dick at times, but he was still a character you're falling with to where, well, for one, he had more charisma and was a far better actor, for one. But two, most of the dialogue that's from this guy in the film, that's the love interest of the girl, when she gets cast a spell on him, she ends up having him talk in pretty much dialogue that's nothing but political agenda, basically talking about the Black Lives Matter, talking about, you know, about how, you know, women need to be respected on set. It feels very forced the way they put upon it. And the reason why it also feels forced is because, much like fucking Black Christmas, they make it to where all the males in the movie, and much like Ghostbusters 2016, they're all fucking pretty much either a piece of shit, you're evil, or you're a dickwad. And, I mean, I question it, but I'm just saying, even in the story, that way it plays out, not only did a lot of the villains that they set up don't even really have, like, any much, like, time to really spend on, but it just feels very forced and bullshit. And that's the other thing I got to get into, too, about how the movie basically sets up a villain, which, spoilers for those of you who haven't seen it yet, the father that's in the film, David Duchovny, turns out to be the main bad guy, as you can kind of fucking predict, because the movie pretty much uses, and I shit you not, it pretty much uses the same type of villain approach like they did with Black Christmas, where in that film, turned out, spoilers for that one, Cary Elwes was the fucking bad guy, and it's like, we're doing this shit again? And even when they do set that up, it's short-lived because the final battle they get to was not only so one-sided and pretty much like they had nothing going on, like no stakes at all going into it, but it felt very rushed, like they were just ready to fucking end the movie already. You know, it came and fucking went. And another thing too, they set up in the beginning of the movie that David Duchovny has 3 sons in the film, and they never even come back into play at all with the rest of the movie after they're set up in this whole cult thing going on. So that even makes you wonder, like, what the fuck happened to them? And it makes you, and why didn't they even come toward the end of it when they had their climax? So it made no fucking sense. And not just that, but I gotta question the musical choices in this movie too, because I shit you not, there's actually a musical score they play in this movie where it almost sounds like the singer is saying goo goo gaga. That's how fucking stupid it sounds. Or she's basically trying to do a shitty cover of that Hooked on a Feeling song. I'm just like, what am I listening to, you know? And then this movie just, when it does try to be the whole sequel part, and this is now where I get into my biggest, like, you know, gripe. The sequel part, it basically falls into that our main girl, spoilers, this is your big warning. If you haven't seen it, come back to this video if you've already seen the movie. She is actually related to the main girl from the first one, which was Nancy. And I have a problem with this because, for one, this is so fucking hardly spent on to where most of the movie is just a fucking rehash of the first one. And even when they do bring this up, it feels like there is no build-up. There's nothing that really links it to the first one to really explain much. And it just fucking ends like it's going to set up this fucking sequel. Because it turns out that our main girl in this, she ends up going to reveal that she was adopted, and her mother pretty much knew her birth mother, and we don't get any fucking backstory of how that was linked to the first movie. And even when we reveal, and we don't even, and first of all, I have a kind of a big question about this, because if I recall, Nancy, if in the first one, pretty much was, trying to take over the power that Sarah had in the first movie. And if I recall, I think it would have made more sense had Sarah, been the mother instead, because, she had all the powers at the end of it, and you could have really done something to expand upon that with it. I mean, I understand, you have to bring Nancy in to say that she had a daughter and stuff, but the fact that she was born with this power doesn't make sense, because if she doesn't have it anymore, it's like, why did you not take the more logical approach? I don't fucking know, but yeah, she shows up at the very end of the movie in like a very quick, like 5-second scene, and while it's good seeing her again for us book, if I'm pronouncing it right correctly, again, I still feel like, they just wanted to lead up to a sequel that's, may happen down the line, I don't know. But this movie, I really did not like. It was not only uninteresting the way it played out the story, it takes nothing new to expand on the lore of the craft at all, other than, and when they do try to add new things, it feels less like a craft movie and feels more like an X-Men spinoff, and not in a good way. I already had to sit through that fucking New Mutants movie earlier this year, so I had to be basically reminded twice of, shit that just, they can't get right with certain movies, and so yeah. So I really don't recommend this movie. Now, I say that if you're a fan of the first one, it's probably, I think that's probably where the problem is the fact that it's trying too hard to be like the first movie, because if it would have been probably just a regular remake or even called it something else, maybe you could have done something more with its approach with it, and maybe, had a better writer come involved and not, put in a lot of shit that just felt so rushed and contrived. Maybe, but even still, this movie, even on its own, even not connected to the first film, it still failed on every fucking level. So with that being said, this is definitely going to be one of my worst, and I'm going to be giving this a flat line on the Film Freaks meter. So, for those of you who've also seen The Craft Legacy, and also seen the first Craft as well, let me know in the comments below what you thought about it, and stay safe, and thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in my next review. I'll see you later.